We are very excited to have Sandra Susan Smith with us. She has many wonderful titles. She's the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice, Faculty Director of the Program in Criminal Justice Policy Management, Director of the Malcolm Lanier Center for Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and also the Carol K. Forstheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. She does work in urban poverty and joblessness, social capital, social networks, and more recently, the front end of criminal case processing. Really enjoyed talking with you last night about some of your work with the state, like we do here, including interest in short and long-term consequences of pretrial detention and diversion. And in each of these areas, racial inequality and its root causes are core areas of concern. We're really excited to have her here today to talk about what I understand is kind of newer work, dissecting resisting arrest in cases of police violence. She has asked that we hold questions, except for clarifying, until the end, when we'll have a Q&A. So, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Hillary, and thank you all for the invitation to speak here. It's been many years since my last visit to Madison, and it's really lovely to be back. Although next time, let's figure out a better time of the year so I could enjoy the lake unfrozen. So an estimated 2% of all police interactions and 20% of all arrests in the U.S. involve some form of police violence enacted on civilians. Although most acts of police violence are non-lethal, they produce considerable harm, not only to direct targets, but also their families and the communities to which they belong. Indeed, non-lethal police violence and aggressive policing tactics in general have been shown to aggravate individuals' physical and mental health, diminish academic performance, and worsen educational outcomes among adolescents, and limit social and political incorporation, especially so in Black and Latinx communities, where people are more likely to fall victim to police use of force. A large body of research investigates the predictors and causes of non-lethal police violence by looking at variation across police encounters. Overwhelmingly, these studies take a quantitative approach to identify correlates of police use of force. So a large body of research investigates the predictors and causes of non-lethal police violence by looking at variation across police encounters. Overwhelmingly, these studies take a quantitative approach to identify correlates with police use of force. Consistently strong correlates include the seriousness of the charge, the presence of multiple officers, whether police initiate the encounter, and whether the encounter involved conflict between civilians. Characteristics of the civilian in the encounter, like race, class, gender, the demeanor of the civilian, and also whether the civilian demonstrated a hostile demeanor or was intoxicated, are weakly correlated once these other kind of major factors are taken into consideration. Across these studies, however, civilian resistance has had the second largest correlation with police violence, behind only civilian arrest status. Indeed, Bolger conducted a meta-analysis of police use of force and found that across 44 studies, suspects who resisted were 3 times more likely to have force used against them. It's to the extent that Bolger argues that suspect resistance is of great importance to research on the use of force, as studies that fail to include the variable risk errors of misspecification. The implication of much of this research then, and Bolger in some ways reasserts this, is that certain civilian behavior prompts police use of force. And if civilians were to stop behaving, this is the implication, in problematic ways, well, police would stop acting on them in aggressive and violent ways. So for at least one reason that I'm going to focus on today, however, the link between resisting arrest and police violence should be met with a bit of skepticism. The biased data sources of data, and an almost unquestioned assumption by researchers sometimes about the direction of the relationship, as with Bolger, between these two phenomena really kind of is centered in this discussion. Although there are selection biases that are worth further consideration for our purposes, the main concern here is that police administrative data or police agency data is largely derived from police reports of encounters between themselves and civilians. And most of our understanding about the relationship between resisting arrest and police use of violence comes from these studies. Using police administrative data assumes the officer's perspective on what happened and why in their encounters with civilians. Police officers, however, are not neutral or objective arbiters of the truth, even when acting without malicious intent. They are, like all humans, meaning makers whose understanding of what has occurred and whose theories about why are shaped by their own intersecting positions in social structure. But the issue, of course, too, is that officers do, too, act with malintent. They have many great reasons, or great many reasons, to and incentives to subvert the truth. Not many great reasons, great many reasons, let's be very clear, to subvert the truth. Legal, moral, and financial. And so in a context where accountability mechanisms are weak or often non-existent, they routinely do. Consequently, administrative data is not an unfiltered window into police-civilian encounters. Instead, it arguably reflects retrospective police justifications of what has happened in that encounter. In the case of resisting arrest, this is further complicated by the fact that resisting arrest is a chargeable offense and a legal defense for using force. So once you have put resisting arrest on the table, it enables you by law to act violently against someone, right, and be absolved. Officers routinely engage in excessive use of force that cannot be reasonably justified, especially so against society's most vulnerable, including low-income people and people of color. Resisting arrest charges can and do offer a post hoc explanation and thus justification to administrators, to researchers, and the public for their use of force. Thus far, however, surprisingly little research, or a few researchers, have systematically examined the circumstances under which resisting arrest is alleged to have occurred from the perspective of the targets of police violence. Now, there are reports, civilian complaints of police conduct does exist, but it's a very kind of biased data set in and of itself. It's sampling on the dependent variable in some ways. You're getting people who have a reason to want to put forward a complaint. Why would you go through all that trouble, especially for a system that does not tend to respond to people unless you have a particular kind of bias that brings you to the fore. And so that is not the most reasonable data source to use either. So given these questions then, we asked the following questions. And when I say we, I failed to mention my co-authors on this study, Isaac Dalke and Jacqueline Lepe, both PhD candidates at the University of California, Berkeley, in the Department of Sociology. So we've asked three questions. First, how well do allegations of resisting arrest align with respondents' reports of encounters? And what are the implications of misalignment for understanding resisting arrest in the context of police violence? The second question is, how do respondents understand the circumstances leading up to the violence in cases characterized by civilian resistance? And then finally, is resisting arrest a causal or a cause of non-lethal police violence, as much of the research seems to suggest it is, or a consequence of that same violence? So questions, so here's the data and analytic approach. As Hillary pointed out, this is kind of new work. I've not really studied this particular issue before, but I was, can I say, inspired by the events of George Floyd and the many other issues of brutality before and after that. Because I've been collecting data on people's experiences with pretrial detention, and that data includes a lot of accounts by respondents about their various experiences and encounters with police over time. So my co-authors and I thought that we could really exploit these data to look at this question, although we did not intend when collecting the data to answer this question. And so this is based on my, this particular paper is based on my San Francisco pretrial detention and diversion project, where the primary interest is in understanding why spending any more than one day in pretrial detention can dramatically worsen people's socioeconomic, political outcomes. It just worsens their lives, generally speaking. It's a sample of 191 people who've experienced low-level contact with the criminal legal system, the majority of whom have spent some time in pretrial detention. It's a convenient sample recruited from San Francisco pretrial diversion. These are low-risk, low-level defendants who were diverted because they were presumed to be low-risk and low-level. We interviewed them about 3 years after the arrest and pretrial or diversion experience that put them on our radar in an effort to give people enough time, if it were to happen, to have further criminal legal system contact, because we wanted to see the extent to which their pretrial detention experiences impacted or in some ways were associated with future criminal legal system involvement. So we asked a series of questions to get at, to understand their own personal background, their affiliations, the extent and nature of substance use and mental health issues, kind of get a history of their experiences with law enforcement, but then also the impact that these experiences had on their outcomes thereafter: employment, housing, the quality of relationships with family members, friends, associates, et cetera. Our approach is both deductive and inductive. We can talk about this and other aspects of the data and collection moving forward, but because we have so little time, I'm going to kind of move right through this. This sample is not surprisingly, because we're talking about people who've had contact with the criminal legal system, majority male. It's diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, but our sample is almost evenly balanced among Black, Latinx, and white individuals. Also, diversity in terms of class and connection to the labor market. Now, encounters with the police. I'm going to start by saying there's a way in which this talk it goes in two directions. The first, it's outlined in such a way that really links what we are doing in this paper with what others who do quantitative research have done. So you will see that some of the results that we're presenting look very much like what others have found. And then we switch to the more qualitative aspect. We're really trying to interrogate people's experiences to understand this link between resistance, whatever that ends up meaning, and police violence. So first, encounters with the police. We largely understand the encounters with the police by asking them a series of questions about the different times that they've had contact with the criminal legal system or with the criminal legal system. So for first arrest, first conviction, and the arrest or citation that led to pretrial detention and diversion, which put them on our radar. And specifically, we asked, could you tell us about the circumstances that led up to that arrest? Basically, from the beginning of that moment until the end, right? So we're trying to just tell us the story, right? And then we probed, where were you? Did you know why the police were stopping you or arresting you when that happened? What happened before the police stopped you? Were you treated fairly? What makes you think this? Were your rights violated in any way? For instance, were your rights read to you? Were you able to make a phone call? Were you able to access a lawyer? That kind of thing. So that's how that's essentially the question we asked with regards to first arrest, first conviction, the arrest and citation. And then we asked in terms of experiences of being unfairly treated. Have you ever been unfairly stopped, searched, questioned, physically threatened, abused, and or otherwise treated inappropriately by the police? Now, I lay this out because I wanted to be very clear what types of questions led to the descriptions that people offered about their accounts with regards to these police encounters. And so after taking a deep dive into all the data and coding every instance where people talked about an encounter with police, where there was enough information there to be able to put together a story, we uncovered 375 encounters. On average, each respondent provided about 2, but there's a range between 1 and 8 encounters across our sample. These are the characteristics of the encounters that you see here. We don't really have to go into a great detail about it, but one of the things you might notice is that that a high percentage of the people of these encounters ended with arrest. A high percentage had the presence of more than one officer. The person who was being whose encounter we're centering had other folks who were nearby that they were connected with. There were presence of other citizens who were, or civilians who were there and who saw the encounter to play itself out. Police initiated the encounter according to these reports in about 2/3 of the cases. And importantly, violence occurred in about 20% of the encounters that folks described. Now, I just want to be clear again that people did not know coming into this study that we were studying police violence or its relationship to resisting arrest. So as they're telling us this story, they're telling us a story because we tell us about this thing, right? So they have no sense that, and we didn't even at the time, that this is where this would be headed. So they were able to give us enough information so that we could really fill out and fill in, be able to connect what we're trying to do here with what other researchers have done in the past with more quantitative data. What we learned about the violence that they experienced, we basically drew from prior research to identify these 3 major categories of violence. Severe hold.
I just want one clarification. The violence occurred, is that specific to the police being violent with, what happens if there's a fight between the defendant and the police officer? Would that just be coded as, is that any kind of violence that occurred?
Any kind of violence that,
yeah.
No, any kind of violence, including struggles between, yeah, that's exactly right. So the nature of the violence, severe holds, impact methods, and display of or use of weapon, baton, taser, showing the gun. In about 30% or 1/3 of the cases, it was a severe hold or restraints. In over half the cases, there were impact methods. And so these are when you got hit, kicked, tackled, is what we would refer to as the impact methods, and then of course the weapons, the tasers, guns, batons. In most of the cases that where the people described these kinds of encounters, they described an encounter where one form of violence took place, and in most of those cases it was either the impact methods or weapon display or use. When 2 methods were used, it tended to be either the severe restraints and impact methods. So you can imagine, especially since, I'm going to point this out, the overwhelming majority of incidences the violence happened before the arrest actually took place. Right, so you can imagine the impact method, and then the severe restraints went to, so you could put those together. So I think before I started to do this work, I would have imagined that a lot of the violence was happening during the arrest process. You're struggling to get them, and but it actually happens fairly quickly at the beginning of the interaction, according to our respondents' reports. Now we try to look at this by the presence of violence and try to think about how this relates to what prior research has found. And we do see some points of alignment here. So for instance, that the violent encounters are more likely to result in arrest. It is also the case that the presence of more than one officer also is more likely to be, a violent encounter is also one that where more than one officer is involved. They tend to be just slightly more likely to be police initiated, as opposed to having someone, having a civilian call the police and bring the police to the scene. We also see, too, that there's a correlation between a violent encounter and there being conflict between citizens. So there's already conflict involved, and so police are brought in or come to resolve that conflict. And importantly, that resisting arrest is alleged. In nonviolent encounters, resisting arrest is rarely reported, right? It's in the context of violent encounters where we see resisting arrest. In 20% of violent encounters, resisting arrest was reported to have occurred, according to our respondents' accounts of their experiences. So this is based in California. It was important to have some sense about California law with regards to resisting arrest. Resisting arrest in California, and probably this is the case elsewhere, is not specific to law enforcement. It also any public kind of official, EMT workers, et cetera, who are doing this kind of work, you can get having a resisting arrest charge if you willfully resist, delay, and or obstruct any public officer, peace officer, or an EMT in the discharge of their duties. Usually the focus is on fleeing when it comes to officers, police officers fleeing, threatening an officer, assaulting an officer, and using a fake ID, which I think is associated with a kind of fleeing, if you will, trying to obstruct justice in a way. So those are the major categories that come to the fore. So how well do the allegations of resisting arrest align with the respondents' reports of these encounters? So the overwhelming majority of our encounters are encounters where resisting arrest is not an issue. Neither the state alleged it, nor did our respondents describe it in their accounts. In 91%, neither brought it up. So of the 375. But in 3% of the cases, it was a case where the state and the respondent described resisting arrest. At 3% of the case, neither the state alleged it or the respondent alleged it. I'm sorry, respondent described the resistance arrest only. And in less than 2% of the cases, the state alleged resisting arrest, and the respondents their accounts said that it did not happen. Okay? Here's a better way of, actually, this is not the better way of looking at it, but we'll get to a better way soon. But here we do have, and I'm going to move away from that, we do have the major categories here. So neither, it's just not on the table. Nobody is saying anything about resisting arrest. This is where it's alleged the state said it happened. They were charged with either assaulting an officer or with or resisting a pure resisting arrest charge, but the respondent does not describe the encounter in a way that suggests that happened. This is a category with where the respondent describes behavior that is consistent with resisting arrest, but they were not charged with resisting arrest at all. And then this is a category where the state alleges it, and respondents do describe behavior that seems to suggest it. And so what I want you to really kind of clue in on, these are all of the kind of consistent major predictors. These are the ones that tend to be less often, they tend to be weaker correlates, but I do want us to zoom in on two of these correlates. Drinking involved and mental health episodes. This really shows up for both, for where resistance is alleged and described. We see that those are much more likely to be associated with resisting arrest encounter. So in 80% of the cases, and these are small n's, so I'm very, very clear about that, but we already understand that relatively few people experience this. So we're just trying to get a sense of what these patterns might look like. 80% of the cases where the state alleged it, drinking was involved. 50% where they both agree drinking was involved. We also see greater involvement in cases of mental health episode, in cases where both have said that there was some kind of resisting arrest. And where we're talking about mental health episode, I'm not speaking specifically about people who say that they have a mental health illness. I'm talking about people who were in a state, like they were really upset, perhaps they had gotten into a big fight with someone, so they were really angry or really disturbed in that moment. You were acting out of the norm for you, and in a way that puts you in a very different kind of state. And so it made you fairly vulnerable. So you could think about it in terms of how people might get when they do have a kind of mental health issue, but it's not because they have a diagnosis. It's because they just come out of a situation that caused them to be so upset that they were really out of the normal in terms of how they behave. So with specific focus on characteristics of violent encounters, so this is all about those who were in violent encounters, we find very similar set of patterns. I want to highlight the weapon involvement here, though, and I want to highlight that because it only comes up in descriptions of people who were neither alleged to have resisted arrest or reported or described it in their accounts. So weapon involvement seems to have no relationship with resisting arrest. It's an odd thing because you would think if threat is one of the things that get police to act in an aggressive manner, having a weapon would be something that would get me to act, right? Immediately, I'm already pulling out the gun that I don't have, right? Because that is a threat. And in this situation, it doesn't seem to move police officers in any way to respond. So the most threatening of some of these characteristics that we're seeing is the one that doesn't seem to register. And it's something that the bodies of research have noted as well, and are trying to figure out how to make sense of in ways that would make their theory that officers are responding to threat and that's what makes them become violent make sense. So here again, though, I want to highlight the role of drinking and mental health. I think the story we would get from both of these past two slides is, well, we see the story here, right? It's a person drinking too much or is in a state, got an attitude with the officer, maybe, got a bit too aggressive and violent, and then things got out of hand. It escalated out of control, which I think is a reasonable, I would think this. But it's not quite how this ends up working out. It does matter, but not in the ways that we tend to think, or not always in the ways that we tend to think. So where violence occurred, in the overwhelming majority of cases where no one alleged resisting arrest, 15% of those cases, violence happened. No resisting arrest. But in the cases where violence was either alleged or described, it was very likely to have happened. It happened in all the cases where the state alleged that the person engaged in violence, but the respondent said that didn't happen, or described the incident in a way that suggested it didn't happen. It happened in the majority of cases where the respondent described it, but the state didn't prosecute or charge. And it happened in the overwhelming majority of cases where both the state and the respondent. So what we're seeing here is that violence is if resisting arrest is called, violence is almost certainly a part of that story. Please.
Just a question. So am I thinking correctly if I think that 5.2% is just kind of a normed and steady state of police violence because it's neither alleged it? Is that a right interpretation?
The 15.2%?
Like an average amount of police violence when you encounter police because neither is alleging. Is that a way to characterize that or no?
That might be a way to characterize it. I don't feel 100% confident to say yes, but we do know that in, say, 20% of situations where someone is getting arrested, violence occurs, right? And these are not all cases where people are being arrested. About 2/3 of my encounters are folks who've gotten arrested, not all of them. And so violence is happening. So I think that might be very close to the case, that might be close to the truth. So I think a bit more about it. Again, we get back to the nature of violence. Remember, I'm sure you do, that my ends are small with regards to the folks who've experienced violence. But what we're seeing happening is when there's no resisting arrest alleged, but violence did happen, about a quarter of it is the severe restraints. About almost half of it relates to people who've have the impact methods used against them, and about half too are folks who had a weapon displayed or used against them. When we look at the cases where resisting arrest is alleged or described, we see much higher percentages of folks who've experienced the impact methods. So we're talking the kicking and the hitting and the tackling, much more likely to happen. So it suggests that there's something too about the resisting arrest that produces much more impact and less of some of these others relative to the category where resisting arrest is not playing itself out. And it also suggests, again, understanding my data limitations, that a greater number of methods of force are being deployed in these situations. So, but what we do see is that if we were to take all the cases where the state is alleging resisting arrest, people are telling stories 2/3 of the time that suggest that some behaviors related to resisting arrest have occurred. So there is some kind of alignment to some degree in terms of people's allegations, the state's allegations and people's description. 2/3 of the cases where the state says it has happened, people say, well, yeah, that this kind of thing something did happen that one might describe in that way. But the devil really is in the details. So how do respondents understand when you ask them to tell these stories? How do they understand the circumstances leading up to the violence in cases characterized by resistance? We identified through iterative coding process 4 categories. The first is a set of folks, and this aligns with the alleged resistance that people do not describe, where people say, it did not happen. It did not happen. I did not resist. There was nothing that I did. No fleeing, no threatening, no hitting, no fake ID. A very odd category to me. They also report, another category are those folks who said that they had resisted, but they didn't know they were resisting a police officer. The police officers would either come from behind and aggressively, like they would jump on them or tackle them, or hold them, like very aggressively, while they were out, we'll get into the details, while they were out drinking, etc., right? So I'm drinking, so I'm probably a little buzzed or drunk. Someone comes and hits me from behind or tackles me from behind. Because I don't know, you will see some of these stories. So they didn't know, which calls into question this notion of willful resistance, right? 2 other categories, there was resistance, but also some complications. They knew and they fled. In many cases, this was primarily to avoid violence. These cases are often associated with people who are in particular occupations, graffiti artists or writers, drug dealers, in some cases shoplifters, but to a lesser extent. People who have routine interactions with police officers that they literally describe as a kind of cat and mouse game. I know when the police arrive, I need to go, because if I don't go, I will get beat badly. This is just how this happens. And so we know to take off. If we don't, we will get hurt. And so it's just a part of what we do with each other. So it's a kind of dance that people are kind of describing. And then they knew and they refused to comply with law enforcement officers, but also in a way that gets problematized. So the first, they did not resist. When asked about the circumstances leading up to his first arrest, 28-year-old Jackson White recounted the following. In terms of telling stories, the first one is probably the most heinous, just because, well, this officer, his name is Officer Maxwell. He works for the WCPD, the Walnut Creek Police Department. We were probably in the first crew of graffiti writers to come from that area and really hit the city pretty hard. So his graffiti crew. They flew Officer Maxwell in from New York to investigate who was doing all of this. They had suspected it was us, but for graffiti, it's really interesting. They actually have to catch you in the act to be able to prosecute you, and he couldn't. He was incapable of doing it. So he pulled us over randomly and searched us, and then basically beat me up, and then charged me with resisting arrest. But that was his way of sort of putting me in the criminal justice system to continue to harass him. So now he's a part of the web, the sticky web of the criminal legal system. So that was the tactic on their part, which was pretty bad. That was the first time I went to jail. I was pretty pissed because we weren't really doing anything. We weren't even painting. It was just that they had suspected that it was us, and they couldn't prove it. And the way that they had to do it was to basically find you, beat you up, and then throw you in jail, and then charge you with resisting arrest. Now you have a criminal record, and that's with me now the whole time. So here, resisting arrest was not in response to, it was actually a kind of tool or method for the officers to be able to bring into the system folks that they suspected of a crime that they could otherwise not they could not prove, and so this was the way to do it. But there are a number of other examples in this realm. I will move on to the next category, though, as time is running out, and that is that they didn't know. Here I'll reference the experience of Chantel. She's a 23-year-old Black woman with some college education, and she was working in a restaurant, low income. Her encounter begins with police tackling her from behind at night as she was walking away from a fight with friends. This is her account in her own words. In my head, it's self-defense because she hit me, the officer, police officer, actually. I went to jail for fighting a police officer in San Francisco, yes. It was when the Giants had won the World Series, actually. Everybody was out there turned up, having fun. Shit had been happening between me and my friends. So I got mad and I walked off, I walked away. I'm walking away, rolling up some marijuana. Basically, I'm about to calm myself down. I don't know what the reason was, but the officer she came up from behind me and tackled me. Like lightweight. Me, I don't know who it is, I fought back. You come from behind, I ain't know who you was, and I start fighting back. And as a result of that, a group of other officers came in, and I was trying to, and they were trying to help, and they all basically piled on top of her. So we could see here how resisting arrest charges eventuate in this situation. I am going to pause the discussion about Chantel now because Chantel becomes important again with the final category where we're talking about people who actually chose at some point to resist. But you could see her story begins with not knowing she was engaging police officers when the encounter began. So the thing that they are describing initially as resisting wasn't resisting because she was not willfully attempting to, she didn't know she was dealing with officers. Yeah. 1:30. Oh, I thought we went to 1:15. Okay. So I have a bit more time. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm looking at 1:15, and I feel like I'm going to get one question. So I appreciate you very much. I'm going to slow down a bit now. So then the next category, though, is that they knew and they ran. And recall that I indicated that there were there was actually a couple of groups of respondents who described a very similar set of experiences to what I'm about to describe. These were, again, folks who were graffiti artists or graffiti writers. These were, and these are also drug dealers. To a lesser extent, this was the case as well for shoplifters. They described a kind of routine engagement with police officers where violence was just a part of the set of interactions that they had. Joshua was a 52-year-old Black man with a lengthy history of arrest and incarceration. He was surviving off SSI from disabilities related to his lifelong struggles with drug use and mental health disorders. Joshua had mainly been arrested for using and selling drugs for the crimes that to help support his substance use, including petty theft. Joshua's drug selling career began when he was 11 years old. He worked as a lookout for drug dealers in his neighborhood, someone who would keep an eye out for police and warn when they were approaching. He began soon selling drugs himself in the 1980s when the crack epidemic swept his neighborhood. His early experiences taught him that running from police was a survival strategy that helped him and others like him avoid police violence. He states, but I learned a long time ago when I was in the drug game. When I first started selling drugs, I never got arrested for that. I was a child selling drugs from the time I was 11 years old. I learned then to run from police. Run, because back then, they had what they called a task force, a real task force. And they had a crew called the Villagers Crew. And when they caught you and when they arrested you, they used to beat you up and take all your money. So that was a given. You knew when they catch you that they were going to beat your ass and they were going to take your money. It was Joshua's peers who taught him that running from the police was what those who were in this game had to do. It was expectation even. They also explained to him what might happen if police caught him. After a few failed attempts, Joshua learned this lesson firsthand. He said, I was younger. People just told me what to do, or I would run and get away. I got stitches in my head one time from trying to run from the police. I got my head busted open. They caught me, bust me in the head. That happened to me twice. I got a bunch of stitches in my head. That's probably part of my mental problems. He laughs when he says this. I got a lot of head injuries. So Joshua learned from that when confronting police, his role as a drug dealer was to run away. And that was the role of the police officers to exert force when they succeeded in catching him. Again, a kind of cat and mouse game. But what was so interesting was how often this kind of narrative came up, and not just with regards to drug dealers, but also, and actually even more potently for the graffiti artists. Who would describe this very exact set of encounters. And the expectation then within the community of graffiti artists or drug dealers that this is how you have to respond. So here again, and then you would get the charge of resisting arrest to cover for the violence that had been enacted on you. So very much kind of culturally rooted in a kind of dance that they would play with suspects in particular subcultures. And then finally, they're the folks who knew that they were dealing with police officers and just kind of refused to reply. And I'm going to get back to Chantel's story because it didn't end with the cops kind of piling on top of her. After that, they did get up, and she reports that police acted violently towards her later in that encounter as well, after this initial dust had settled. This continuation illustrates this final category of encounters. After police let up, an officer began to take Chantel to the police car. She explains, the officer, he was racist and he was sexist. Like, he told me he would stick his D in my mouth to shut me up. Yes, because I'm a lesbian. They said little stuff that wasn't right, straight up. And that made me really, really mad. I started going off again. After the police officer demeaned her and threatened sexual violence, Chantel became so upset that she refused to get in the police car. In retaliation, the officer hit her in the head with a baton, leaving her with a permanent head injury. She elaborates, I wasn't going willingly. He's saying stuff just to get me inside there, and I guess I wasn't cooperating with him, and it made him mad. He just gets to say and do whatever he wants to say. So Chantel understood that the officer's violent actions were as a result, this is her understanding, as a result of his mounting frustration with her for refusing to comply while he demeaned and taunted her. This locked in a set of interactional dynamics where the officer's deeply offensive behavior provoked the resistance from Chantel that then cued the officer's use of, in some ways, additional force, because we understand what happened in the earlier part of this. I want to remind you, too, that about how, for Chantel, this interaction is one that where alcohol and some drugs were involved, and so probably contributed to how she at least initially responded, although I find very understandable some of what she's described after. But I don't want to stop with Chantel, because I think that there's another interesting case that helps to kind of illuminate how resisting arrest charges get used in some contexts, even where people are resisting, but not necessarily in ways that would warrant the violence that gets perpetrated on them. And here I'm going to talk about Kyle's experience, or have Kyle tell you himself. In Kyle's words, I was walking home. I was leaving the bars early. Drinking was involved here again. It was only like 12 a.m. And I stopped at a hot dog vendor. Never stop at a hot dog vendor, or never stop at hot dog vendors. And I was just trying to get a hot dog, and this cop comes up and they're like, where's your license? And the guy's like, I don't have one. Well, you can't be here. And I was like, this is my fault for being an idiot and trying to stand up for the guy and ultimately get my hot dog. I said something. That's when he told me to take my little bitch ass and walk away. Like, it was just really weird, because I have never been talked to before by somebody like that, just so blatantly too. That's not an incident. That was just him being like, I think, just irritated with all the shit he had been getting the whole day from all these drunk people, and him just kind of seeing me as a scapegoat because I'm it's just me and this vendor and nobody really else. So he's suggesting that it's quite quiet so he could respond in this fairly abusive way if he wants to. So on the side of the street, not a whole lot of foot traffic or anything, I don't know. Just, I said one thing like, oh, come on, man, that's kind of messed. And then he just said, shut up. Well, I shouldn't have said anything in the first place. I get that. But that's how soft you are mentally, that you just come out with an insult and want to berate me a little bit. Again, I'm not in the clearest mind myself, so I'm a little reactive. And it just snowballed from there. And the next thing I know, the dude is trying to put a hand on me. And I, like an idiot, fucking smacked it and then took off running. And now I'm here interviewing with you. So that got him arrested and signed up for pretrial detention. But then he goes on to describe how he got fucked up. They beat him so badly that he had to be put into the hospital. And so he's like, are you fucking kidding me? It was just so stupid. His pinky was broken. He says, my little pinky, but it was still broken, and it was still a fucking $800 check for an emergency room visit, not to mention the fucking ambulance ride that they put me in because I was concussed and my face was all fucked up. From them pushing it into the street and putting their knee on the back of my neck, stupid thing like that. And this is the part I don't get, because they wrote in the report that I got away and that they couldn't find me or anything like that. And then they said all of a sudden I appeared out of nowhere around the corner and attacked them and came at them. And that is why they responded to him in such a way that he became so bruised that he had to be hospitalized. He reports that the whole police report that he got to see through his defense attorney was riddled with inaccuracies. He's 5'9" and 160 pounds. They said he was 6'3" and 250 pounds. There were a series of other inaccuracies, including the one about, according to Kyle, about how he returned to fight them after having gotten away. So he explains that the violence, to some extent, he had fled, and so that was a kind of resistance. But the violence that came well after he fled. They got him, and then they beat him so badly that he needed to be hospitalized. So the question of causation is a good one here. So is resisting arrest a cause of non-lethal police violence, as most research seems to suggest, or a consequence of that same violence? I think many of the respondents' reports call into question what most research seems to suggest. And what our respondents are telling us across these four categories, they didn't do anything. They didn't know they were engaging with police officers. They did it, but they fled to avoid violence, and they were annoying. And probably should not have engaged in the way that they did, but the violence that was perpetrated on them seemed to be really kind of disproportionate to the situation. They offered at least four major explanations for what was happening. Many of us have heard the concept contempt of cop. The officers became upset when they were not treated with the kind of respect that they felt like they deserved, and so they acted aggressively when faced with that situation. To some extent, Kyle's situation is probably a reflection of this. But Kyle's situation is also a reflection of perhaps the second, as a cover for unnecessary and excessive use of force, which we see in a lot of cases. There's actually a term for it. Jamming you up is what one of my respondents said is a term commonly used to describe when cops lay the resisting arrest charge on you to cover for the fact that they have inappropriately acted violently against you. I think the kind of elaborate cat and mouse game that our graffiti artists and drug dealers, to a lesser extent shoplifters, described is also a part of this, as a legitimate means to bring targets into the system. was another way in which a few of our respondents described what they thought was happening here. So you can call resisting arrest under almost any circumstance, whether you are acting violently or not, and it's a way for bringing people into the system for some. So that's unfortunate enough, but for some it is also associated with being acted violently against. And then a couple of our respondents said that they were threatened with or there was an allegation of resisting arrest in order to coerce a target to give them information that they otherwise would not be able to get. So these were major themes that emerged in our respondents' descriptions of what connected the violence that they experienced when resisting arrest happened. So there are, of course, a number of limitations to this study. Two major ones is that there might be a concern about how the specific prompts we use, which is why I shared them with you. Maybe those were prompts that would lead people to, talk about the violence they experience in a particular way. I don't think so. I think we were fairly open in terms of how we invited them to share with us, and again, did not let them know what the purpose of these questions were, and even at the time had no intention of using these data for this purpose. But it's possible that that's an issue. And then, of course, there's a question about different kinds of bias. We're asking people, in some cases, a couple of years or more, about their experiences. Recall could be off. People might be misremembering things. I do think it's interesting that at least the descriptive stats map on pretty well with what quantitative research is finding. And so that gives me a bit of confidence that what people are sharing is fairly, their experiences are not out there. I would be concerned if that was the case. But I do think we always have to be concerned about recall when we're asking people about things that have happened to them, even weeks, but certainly months and years from when it happened. And it could be possible, too, that people are sharing these stories in ways that downplay what they have done in these set of interactions to make themselves, or the bad things that they've done to make themselves look good. And so that is always possible. I think that is the case. But what I found so interesting, my co-authors and I find so interesting, is how similar the accounts were across our different respondents. They're not. It's not as if the stories are so very kind of unique. They're telling us in ways that suggest there are patterns that emerge in these different kinds of encounters. That even if there might be some desire to show, make oneself look good, it's still producing a set of outcomes that look very similar across these folks. And they're fessing up to other things, right? So the guy who does the graffiti, we were messing that city up with our graffiti, kind of admitting to being responsible for quite a bit of things. So not completely washing clear what their role might have been in the interaction. But here again, I think the question of social desirability is one that we should be paying attention to. Now, implications, I think they're theoretical, empirical, and policy-oriented, or methodological and policy-oriented implications. One, again, much of the literature thinks about this as a causal relationship where resisting arrest is responded to by police officers with violence. I think that there's real reason to question this particular kind of theoretical account. I think our research suggests that given the patterns that we're seeing across our respondents' responses, that really the resisting arrest as an offense that allows police officers to engage with civilians in a violent manner really is a kind of tool to facilitate the unquestioned and unjustified domination and control of vulnerable populations. So far less is it the cause of police violence? In many cases, it looks like it is actually the way in which police cover the violence that is already happening, and for different motivations. So I think we really need to rethink how, the literature needs to rethink how it is positioning the relationship between those important variables. And it calls into question the common highlighting of the role that resisting arrest plays in helping us to make sense of the cases where police violence happens. You might recall the quotation by Bulger where he says, if you don't include this, you're going to there's going to be kind of misspecification in your models. Well, we can include it, but we have to make sense of it very differently than how it has in prior research. The methodological concerns are around the deployment of these administrative data, most often from police agencies, but also from other sources that have these biases embedded in them, very questionable. Notice that up until as I looked at the data in much the same way quantitative researchers have looked at it, our results were looking very similar to, even if mine are descriptive, very similar to what the accounts are that come from the quantitative data. When we start to look at how it is that people are talking about these experiences, though, that's when it starts to deviate, right? How we make sense of what is actually happening on the ground. The interactional dynamics that unfold lead to a very different telling and actually leads one to imagine that the causal relationship is in the other direction. So we really need to pay attention to the role that methods play, and perhaps, not even perhaps, we should be centering qualitative data to better understand what lies in the quantitative data, especially administrative data, that we use and take for granted in terms of its quality. And then finally, there are the policy implications. Now, it is the case that resisting arrest had been not illegal up until the 1940s. You could resist arrest legitimately in this country up until the 1940s. And then as we neared the civil rights movement, or as the civil rights movement unfolded and all sorts of protests on the ground, that's when most states across this country made resisting arrest an offense. And then soon attached on the caveat that an officer who was met with resisting arrest could legitimately engage in violence, right? So that unfolds during the civil rights era, perhaps not surprisingly, right? One of the implications of this research is that we need to rethink, well, we probably should never have gone in this direction, but we need to rethink whether or not resisting arrest should be in the criminal code at all. And there are a couple jurisdictions, I don't want to say a few because that really makes it sound like it's happening in way more places than it is, jurisdictions that are dealing with resisting arrest very differently for this very reason. So in Suffolk County, which is where Boston is located, the former prosecutor had refused to prosecute resisting arrest as a standalone charge or as a charge that was associated with other misdemeanors, because she understood, Rachel Rollins understood that it was being used in this way to either trump up charges or to create charges where there otherwise would not be. Now, she's been replaced by she got a promotion, she's been replaced by a new prosecutor who is likely not living up to that same. So we're probably back to a place where resisting arrest is a punishable offense again. But there's also been some efforts by the court. Massachusetts Judicial Supreme Court held in Commonwealth versus Warren that we cannot presume, especially in the case of Black men, that running away from a scene is evidence of any kind of guilt. Nor can they be beat up for it, or should they be beaten up for it, because historically speaking, the ways in which police have interacted with members of the Black community should give many Black people reason to fear. And so that alone could be the reason behind their fleeing. And so what they did, while they didn't stop, the SJC didn't stop running from, they didn't take it off the table in terms of what one could, in terms of thinking about whether or not someone was guilty. They did call into question whether that could really be used, to the extent that there could be many other reasons rooted in a history of racism that would lead people like, I can't remember was it Jordan, the older fellow's name, who routinely did this, that this is something that could produce, that kind of history can produce these kinds of responses and should not be then responded to in the way that we have. And then finally, despite some suggestion with these first 3 bullet points that maybe we can move in a direction that is more promising and remove this tool from police officers, there's actually, I think, a counter movement afoot where we might be amplifying the number of kinds of laws that allow police to engage in these ways. There's, of course, the respond to protests post the election of Trump. 19 states moved towards making protests itself illegal, passed in a couple, failed in more than a couple, but still. In Monroe County, New York, they passed or were considering a bill to make it illegal to annoy cops. I don't know exactly, but that you could see how much room that gives police officers to determine whether or not they are being annoyed and thus reasonably can assert themselves in a violent way. And of course, more recently, where jurisdictions, Arizona stands out, restricting how individuals, either the public or journalists, can film police officers, not surprisingly, very soon after the filming of George Floyd's murder. And so this too can put folks at risk of being the targets of police violence. And so we have, the work has, I think, real implications for policy as well. And I will stop here. I still didn't leave enough time. Maybe you shouldn't have said anything. We had more time for Q&A, but I do appreciate the intervention. I slowed down a bit. I welcome your questions.
One observation. The question is whether when you were looking at the charges that your subjects, your respondents had, whether you've also included other spongy sort of charges like obstructing an officer, failure to obey a lawful order that kind of might have the same result as resisting arrest. And the other thing I'm interested to see is that when you kind of bring the different types of resisting the interviewees had, none of them like just sitting there doing nothing wasn't one of the kinds, because that delaying can also be.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, say the final one again. What were you expecting but didn't see?
Is that because delaying is also a type of
Yeah,
arrest?
yeah.
So you just sit there and like passively resist. That's
Yeah.
Also, but that didn't come out in your ears.
No, I didn't. Yeah, that's right. Although maybe I should take another look. It might be hard to see delaying. And who's going to? I just delayed. I guess there are ways that people could express that that's what they had done. I think people tend to use more active verbs. We haven't taken a look at other spongy offenses, and I think that that's a great idea to take a look at. We try to adhere to the kinds of offenses that tend to come up in the prior research, but I think you're absolutely right. These are not the only ones that can bring about responses that could escalate into violence. So we'll take a look at that. I think it's a great idea. Thank you. Hi, Mike.
Thank you. Yes, really interesting in terms of, and I think, certainly I take your point that the details of the situation matter, right? So at various points you talk about situational dynamics or interactional dynamics, and in the same way that only getting the police report's perspective may omit key details, it's similar to your point about social desirability. I think it's also fair to say that only getting it from the suspect's side would also omit some key, or potentially could omit details. So I'm curious if there's one way I was thinking about maybe we could do this is, particularly in this case because they all involve criminal cases. Now you have a unique...
Not all.
Yeah, so some of them were deferred adjudication, so their cases wouldn't have been there.
Yeah, so the people who are in the sample all had those experiences, but they're telling us about encounters that, so they're between 1, again, and 8 encounters. Some of those didn't have, it could have just been, they could have called the officers to get help. So I would say that there are probably between a quarter and a third that were not involved with their own arrest or adjudication in the system.
So my question is have you and your students thought about potentially trying to triangulate to see, So one way you could do it is, so I actually looked this up in Massachusetts. Apologies, I thought the data was from Massachusetts when I looked at the abstract.
Poor thing.
But the body cam footage is publicly available, particularly.
This would, so
you'd have to FOIA. So I was just wondering, again, because those details matter. If a police officer says, this person took a swing at me, and the respondent says, no, I didn't, well, it matters which one happened, right? And so, like, I was wondering if there's a thinking about sort of pushing this forward in terms of seeing, you know, this person says this, and the officer says that didn't happen, or vice versa. So, and then the other, I'm curious about if that's an idea that would be worth pursuing. It strikes me as, then the other observation I had was, I at least think a plausible explanation for your weapons finding, the
Yeah.
kind of counterintuitive one,
Yeah.
is potentially just has to do with your sample. If I recall, I believe you said this is essentially 196 low-level, you know, these were not, you know, high-level, I don't remember how you worded it, low-level offenses or low-level offenders. And what I'm thinking is, well, if you brandished a weapon in the context of resisting arrest, even, again, we could talk about the details there,
Yeah.
but chances are the prosecutor isn't going to view that as a low-level offense. Like, they wouldn't be in your sample. So I'm wondering if maybe that's just an explanation for the counterintuitive finding, is that if I pull out a gun while an officer's trying to arrest me, I'm not going to be in the low, like, deferred communication sample. But anyway, that was just one potential explanation I thought about as you were talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in your thoughts about the triangulation of the interactions.
So let me respond in reverse. I think what you suggest is possible, but not likely, in part because, as I indicated in the talk, one of the reasons why I just thought it was interesting, and then realized that the body research on this also finds that having a weapon involved is not, I mean, that is not one of the things that is highly correlated with resisting arrest. And my sample is a particular sample of low-level offenders, but the vast majority of work on this, which comes from police agencies, is not just focused on low-level offenders. It includes folks across the spectrum, and they're still finding it. So I feel like there's something there above and beyond the fact that my low-level offenders would, you know, not be showing the weapon, although weapon involved doesn't necessarily mean you showed it. It could just mean that you have it on you, and that in itself would be a threat. So I think it goes beyond my specific sample of low-level offenders, given that the others who have looked at this particular variable, who are not looking solely at low-level offenders, have also found this. I think the question of triangulation is a great one, and I really like the idea. I can't do it with mine, because my folks, or folks who entered the system, or at least got on my radar because of experiences between 2013 and 2016, predating the kind of use of body-worn cameras. So I would have to redo this and then identify make the FOIA request in order to get that. But I think it's a great idea to think about how to triangulate and how to figure out what the truth is as we talk about it. Still, I think the reports by the respondents are valuable in of themselves. I think you're absolutely right to indicate that we all come in with various biases that are rooted in whatever positions we play and whatever stakes we might have in the game. And so we could see why police officers might downplay some things and put other things up at the fore, and we can see why it is that folks who are in these situations would do the same. But what I think is important to add to this space is are these accounts and stories that often get ignored in a context where I think they actually make a lot of difference in terms of understanding these accounts. These accounts map on really well. Okay, so for instance, when we have gotten police reports and about what has happened in encounters, most often they're lethal because otherwise they don't get shown. Police report something, we find the video, and the video does not show what the police have just said, right? Often the video will show what maybe witnesses or other folks who are at the scene will have said. I think by presenting accounts by folks who've experienced the violence in ways that rarely gets done, it does put forward this idea that we need to be doing this kind of work a lot more, above and beyond triangulation, which I think is an excellent idea and would be very generative, to center the voices of the people who tend to be so disempowered that their voices get eliminated or made invisible is, to me, a value in and of itself. And I think it actually does a better job of explaining a lot of what it is that we're seeing than what I've seen in terms of police, the accounts that come from a lot of the quantitative studies. So we do have two separate kinds of accounts that are kind of juxtaposed with each other, and I think it'd be interesting to adjudicate. But I do feel like we have a growing body of evidence of the kind of misconduct that gets described in this in the accounts that my respondents put forward that give a kind of legitimacy to it. And what the other thing that I think gives a kind of legitimacy to it is that these are people who don't know each other, as far as I know. And yet their accounts are so similar. How is that possible? Unless they're all watching the same TV show and then embedding those accounts in their own lives. And I don't think that that's what's happening. They're describing events in their lives that look so close to how other people are describing it. And the commonality is the police. And I think it's difficult to not pay attention to that. It suggests a kind of, I think both a kind of cultural orientation on where police officers are concerned in terms of how they respond to various situations. That violence is a response to many of the troubling experiences that they find themselves in, troubling being very broadly defined. And that there are structures of support that cover it. Because one of the things that I did not describe because of limited time was how people did go and talk to authorities. This person did this, look at me, how did this happen? And officers would look away or recommend that they just go home and just let it go. Or things would be much worse for them if they did, that you can't ever beat the cops. Each of those accounts following this. Which suggests a system that both covers and supports this kind of behavior. So I think that you're absolutely right. From a number of perspectives, it would be really interesting to see, to provide evidence that allows us to adjudicate. But I think the importance of centering these voices alone is a value here. And I think there's enough that comes out in terms of patterns of responses that really gives a kind of legitimacy to what it is that these respondents are reporting. Hi.
So thank you. This has been interesting. So the counterfactual question in the outset. So the presumption that there should be any violence at all amongst a group where there was no resisting or charge of resisting. That small group, that's really interesting to me because that's something about the steady state of the culture of police actions. So when you think about the larger questions that you're asking about the way the whole kind of, the presumptions you go into a study like this with, and so there's the idea of triangulation. I think all that's super useful. But if you're seeing a group for whom it makes no sense there should be any kind of police violence in a situation where it should be functioning in an appropriate way, why should you see any at all? That's odd. Yeah. Makes me wonder about the whole structure. How is that the fact? Yeah. That's a counterfactual question that's interesting to me, along with all the things that you're uncovering in terms of these patterns. But if a system is functioning properly, how should it behave in a situation where there would be no expectation of violence? Right? And I think that's what that small, that whatever percent that was, that's kind of what that's showing you. Because that's how the system operates at a default. And we wouldn't expect it.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you very much.
Time for one more.
Hi.
Hey, for the sake of time, I just want to extend a thank you. I'm the policy analyst for the ACLU of Wisconsin. And we use your pretrial detention work to lobby some politicians and the public against a referendum and a couple bills that will add to pretrial detention. So Just wanted to stand to you in applause and thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. There's no question?
Oh, I have a question too. Do you think de-escalation training or other restructuring of civilian training officers to in the time of resistance to excuse their abuses, or do you think that this is so ingrained in the thought that any kind of outside changes really won't do anything about this?
I knew that I was going to get the training question, a training question. I don't think that this is about training. I don't think the bulk of what it is that we're seeing is about training. I do think training probably could make a difference on the margins. So perhaps it's possible when the rookie is with his older, more experienced partner and is presented with somewhat drunk bargoer, and things get a little heated. Probably some training and a bit of experience could help to learn how to de-escalate that situation where possible. But we're talking about a lot of situations, and I have accounts like this where people describe the officers just getting really kind of escalating in ways that seemed unnecessary given the nature of the situation. But a lot of the different categories of violence that we're talking about are not categories that I think would be resolved with training. So for instance, if we think about the cat and mouse game, that's not about training. They literally have somehow constructed a kind of a culture of engagement. This is what we do. This is how you respond. This is what happens, right? Training, I don't think that they got into that because they lacked training. That seems to be something that is much more a kind of script that folks are following. Here's what I do now. Here's what you do, etc. That's not about training. There are a number of other situations too where I think the police officer who used both beat the person up and used the resisting arrest as an attempt to get that person in the system. Not about training. That's about being frustrated about the fact that the laws aren't doing what you want them to do, and so you're going around it, right? And there are a number of situations like that. Like, I could not quantify how many are happening out in the world, but it's hard to believe that some version of that isn't happening quite a bit. So I honestly think it's only on the margins that training will do much good. And it's actually kind of, I know that that's probably one of the first things we often think about in situations like this, especially where brutality is concerned. But I don't know of a training program that has done much to affect brutality of anybody or vulnerable people. I do think removing the ability to cover your brutality will go a long way, which is why I think we should be talking about the resisting arrest offense, whether we should have it or whether we should allow people to be able to beat other people when they use it, which seems to be the problem. The architecture of the law allows for being able to abuse people and then use this as cover. To me, that's what we need to be tackling. The ways in which we give police officers all of this room to move with impunity. So I would like us to talk less about training and to talk more about transparency and accountability, true accountability. That's what the system on all of its levels, to me, seems to lack.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but what a terrific talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.